Welcome to this second presentation regarding commas. We're going to pick up where we left off when we were together last. So if you haven't watched the first video, you may be a little bit lost. So I encourage you to watch the first video first, and then we'll make progress on video number 2. As you know, we're in chapter 2 of our Aspen book. So if you haven't yet gotten your Aspen book out, go ahead and pause me and find your Aspen book. And if you are in, if you have the green version, we'll be starting on page 36. And if you have the red version, we'll be starting a few pages after that. We'll be starting on page 38. So let's begin. When we were together in our first lecture, we went through the first 4 comma rules. There are 13, by the way, in the Aspen series. We did 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we did kind of the easy ones first. And so now we're going to take on the ones that are a little bit more challenging. So let's go ahead and get started. Rule 5 has to do with introductory material. This is a really, really broad category. If you look at other lists of comma rules, many times this single rule, Rule 5, will be broken down into several separate rules. So as you're out and about and looking, don't be surprised if you see that. I'm going to go ahead and open up a Word document so we can play around a little bit with this one. So, some key words here. We have the word introductory. So this is something that happens before the main clause. Let's talk a little bit about the 2 parts. So we have, which we'll call introductory material. Then we're going to put a comma, and then we're going to have an independent clause. Let's first of all talk about what an independent clause is. It is something that can stand alone as its own sentence. You may recall from the sentence fragment standpoint video, we talked about independent clauses. And what are the 3 things that sentences have to have? They have to have a subject, they have to have a verb, and they have to have a complete idea or complete thought. So if you see after the introductory material that there is something that's like an independent clause, meaning it has a subject, it has a verb, and it expresses a complete thought, then you have this rule satisfied. So let's go back and look at the rule again. Use an introductory comma to set off introductory material in a sentence. When the introductory material is short, meaning fewer than 3 words, the comma may optionally be omitted. Again, we're going to err on the side of including commas even when they're optional. So obviously fewer than 3 words means 1 or 2 words, right? Not too hard to figure out. Now, I have definitely seen the rule described to be 3 or fewer words. So I would actually probably expand it a little bit there. In many cases, though, the comma will help the reader process the information, because this is the signal to the reader, hey, this is introductory. Let's look at a few of these examples, just kind of go through it and play around with them a little bit. Here we go. Okay, so let's look at our first one. So this is our introductory material. I won't include the comma, I'll put that in yellow. And here is the rest of the sentence, which has to be an independent clause. I'm going to put that in green. Let's make sure that it has the 3 elements that we need. What's its subject? Well, this is its subject right here. I'm going to put that underlined. What's its verb? I'm going to put this in italics. And does it express a complete thought? Well, let's read it. The accident occurred on Park Avenue. Yep, it looks like we have an independent clause. Now we have this introductory material, according to the plaintiff. Can we leave this off and the sentence has the same meaning? Yeah, it does. The accident occurred on Park Avenue. This is just additional information about what's coming after us. This is kind of like a parenthetical. It's not essential to the meaning of the sentence to include it. And so under these circumstances, and you'll see many times during this lecture, we'll talk about how the reason that we're putting it in commas is because the information isn't essential. It's an FYI. It's a nice to know, but don't have to include it. It works in many ways like a parenthetical would, or like a footnote might be used, and you can see that it performs this function. If we didn't have this comma, let's consider how the sentence would work. According to the plaintiff, the accident, we don't know where to pause, but when we have the comma, according to the plaintiff, the accident occurred on Park Avenue. If we don't have the comma, and I'm reading this for the first time, according to the plaintiff, the accident, okay, that's where the break is. So the comma is signaling that this is a complete unit. And so, and now we're moving from this introductory material to the main clause. Let me throw you a little bit of a curveball though. Let's take this independent clause. Oops, wait a second. Let me not do that. And let's put this here. Obviously, we're going to have to capitalize the and capitalize, get rid of the period, lowercase a, and put a period. Now let's read it. The accident occurred on Park Avenue, according to the plaintiff. This rule, the rule that we're talking about right now, doesn't provide for a comma in this case, because as we go back and look at the rule, it is required that it be introductory material. Okay? So we don't need to have a comma under these circumstances for this statement. Now, many times people would put a comma. This is one of the problems with the Aspen, is that it doesn't really address this situation. A comma can also be used many times, even when you move it from the introductory position. Let's look at the next sentence. Unfortunately, the judge ruled against us. Well, one thing to notice is that our introductory material is just one word long. So according to the rule, we don't have to put it in, put a comma in front of it. But again, it's a best practice too, because as we're reading it, we would pause. We wouldn't say, unfortunately, the judge ruled against us. We'd say, unfortunately, the judge ruled against us, because we're going from this idea to this idea. And you can see that we have, let me go ahead and put this in green because this is our main clause and this is our introductory material. And you can see we do have an independent clause because it is all the things a sentence needs. We have the subject, the judge, we have the verb, ruled, and it does express a complete thought. The judge ruled against us. We don't have to have the unfortunately for the meaning to be clear. The judge ruled against us. We don't like it, but that's not a big surprise. I mean, obviously it's rare that you would like the judge ruling against you. And in this case, just as in the case above, we do have the ability to move the introductory material to other places. Let me just show you one place we could do. We could say the judge, unfortunately, ruled against us. And so we've actually inserted our introductory material as an interrupter at this point. We'll learn about this rule later on, but the important thing for you to know right now is Rule 5 doesn't say we need a comma here. That's a different rule that we'll get to. So this is just about the beginning material. Now, as we look at these sentences, we can see that they have a lot of, this is a conjunction, this is an adverb, this is a preposition. We have lots of different parts of speech, and there's actually others we could have. Swimming in the ocean, I got salty water in my eyes. This is another example of an introductory material that you put a comma. This is a gerund, or this is a present participle. So there's lots of different ways to start introductory material, but most of the time you're going to have this word and then or many times you're going to have this word and then a clause after. And this word is going to be something that is either a kind of a preposition or a gerund or a conjunction that sets up what follows it. Here we have after, and then we have this word after, which I'll put in pink. And then we have what comes next, which we'll put in baby blue. Then we have although, which is our conjunction. And we have the sentence or the not the sentence, but the phrase or the clause that comes after it. Going back to our original, we have according. And then we have what comes after it. We have in. And we have what comes after it. And you can see how these, here we go. These words introduce the clause. They're not actually about the substance of the clause. This one's a little bit more substantial, but still it's kind of introducing the idea of the clause. The only one of ours that really don't have that is the one word one, which obviously you couldn't have under these circumstances, because the one word, obviously, it's going to do all the heavy lifting, all the lifting at all with respect to that. Okay, so let's look at our next one. And as I say, we actually would put this in commas usually, but that's not because of Rule 5. After the trial has ended, I will take a vacation. Okay, so again, let's see if this clause here, the one in green, is an independent clause. Could it function as a sentence on its own? Well, yeah, it can. We have a subject, I. We have a verbal phrase, will take, and it expresses a complete thought. I will take a vacation. This is additional information about the timing, but this in and of itself is a complete sentence. Okay, so because this is an introductory material to our independent clause, we are going to put a comma here. But let's switch this around. Let's put I will take a vacation after the trial has ended. In this situation, we actually don't put a comma here. It would be incorrect to have a comma under these circumstances because none of our rules provide for it. It's no longer introductory material. Now you might be thinking, well, why isn't this introductory material? Well, an independent clause can't qualify under Rule 5 as introductory material. Let's look at our next sentence. Okay, again, let's see if we have a complete sentence here or not. I mean, could it function as a complete sentence? Okay, well, we have a subject, the defendant. Oh, wait, wrong one. We have a verb, entered. Let's test it to see if it's a complete sentence. The defendant entered Mrs. Harris's residence. That is a complete thought. We could put the first in lots of different places. We could put the first at the end. This isn't a very effective stylistic decision on our part, but it's not grammatically incorrect. We definitely wouldn't put a comma in this situation after it because the only reason that we use a comma is because it was in the introductory position. So we could say the defendant entered Mrs. Harris's residence first. Another thing we could do is we could say the defendant, comma, first, comma, entered Mrs. Harris's residence. Again, Rule 5 doesn't tell us we need the commas, but another rule will. How do I make, oh, there it is, none, sorry. Okay, so that's the takeaway with this one. We need to have introductory material that isn't an independent clause, then an independent clause, and if the introductory material isn't an independent clause, a comma before it. Okay, let's look at the next one. Now we're going to do, although the witness was sick, she attended the hearing. So she is our subject. Underline her. Attended is the verb. She attended the hearing as a complete thought. Now you might say, but, well, Groover, this has a subject, the witness, and this has a verb, was, and the witness was sick expresses a complete thought. Well, that's right, but in front of it is a subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction dooms this clause to a subordinate status. It becomes a dependent clause. Now, we can make it an independent clause by just making this go away, right? I mean, that's an option, but as long as we keep it, this can't be an independent clause. So if we lead into the sentence with this, it qualifies as introductory material. If we have an independent clause afterwards, we need to separate them with a comma. Okay? If we were to reverse the order, she attended the hearing, although the witness was sick. Now we probably ought to change the pronouns and lead with the witness attended the hearing although she was sick. Makes a little more sense. Okay, again, the only reason that we put a comma separating this is because this was introductory material, not an independent clause. When we put it in, not in the introduction spot, not the beginning, we don't put a comma. That is probably the most challenging thing about Rule 5, to keep in mind it's introductory material. If it appears elsewhere in the sentence, Rule 5 doesn't tell you you need a comma. Another rule might, but not Rule 5. Okay, let's look at our next sentence. In June, I will begin trial preparation. In the example, the author did not put a comma here because, after all, the rule says fewer than 3 words. Well, obviously, in June is only 2 words, so it is an exception. I would put a comma, though. In June, I will begin trial preparation. I think it helps the reader follow the sentence, not that it's a hard sentence to begin with. Let's make sure that this is, in fact, an independent clause. So I is our subject. Will begin is our verb. Sorry, got that wrong. I don't know why that is not working. Oh, I think I know why. There we go. I will begin trial preparation expresses a complete thought, so it qualifies as an independent clause. If I were to switch this around, I will begin, oops, well, you have your fingers on the right keys, begin trial preparation in June. Our in June phrase is no longer introductory material, so Rule 5 doesn't tell us that we should put a comma here. And in fact, there is no rule that tells us we need to have a comma. So this is kind of like this one. You may be tempted to put a comma between hearing and although, between a preparation and in, but you shouldn't. Now, if we were to do this, I will begin in June how about this one? This is better. I, in June, will begin trial preparation. Rule 5 doesn't tell us to put this in commas, but you can see that this would be very confusing. I, in June, will be, oh, what? What? You're in June? Is there someone named June that you have, stuck your fist in her mouth or something? It's confusing. And so the commas help us make sense of it. We will have a rule that we'll talk about this later on, but it's not a Rule 5 situation. Okay, so we have covered Rule 6. I'm sorry, Rule 5. Let's go on to Rule 6, and this is the rule that I was hinting at before. So let's go ahead and talk about it substantively. This is when we have an interruptive phrase or a transitional expression. Usually these are very short. Whenever you interrupt yourself, you're basically kind of saying blah, 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 blah. Oh, by the way, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and let me go back to my original topic. That's really confusing for the reader, right? Because the reader you're asking the reader to multitask, to hold one idea in his head and then to think about another idea and then to return to the original idea. So you want that interruption to be very brief usually. And we can see here that three of our four are very brief. And so these are effective interrupters, effective transitional tools. But if they get too long, we probably want to use them in the introductory position, not in the we want to use the rule 5 way. We want to put the beginning of the sentence as opposed to the interruption position. Well, let's look at these for a second. Okay, you can see that our sentence, I'm going to make the interrupter go away. Let's look to make sure we have an independent clause here. Let's read it. The jury voted to acquit the defendant. Well, the jury is the subject. Voted to acquit is the verb. Does it express a complete thought? The jury voted to acquit the defendant. Yep, it sure does. So we have an independent clause. Okay, and now we're going to add back our however. Apparently, in a previous sentence, we said something that suggested that maybe this wasn't what was going to happen. Maybe we had talked about how strong the case was against the defendant. And so maybe we had been stating things that might have led the reader to think, oh, this defendant is going down. And yet now we say, oh, no, we're going to zig where you thought we were going to zag, in other words. And so that's how we use however. However is an interrupter. It's showing, hey, I'm going a different direction. And so interrupters are going to be set off with commas. And that makes sense because this isn't essential to the sentence. It is like a parenthetical because the sentence works without the however. Now, you may think to yourself, well, why would you ever use an interrupter? Why would you distract the reader in that way? Well, actually, it can oftentimes help the reader make sense. If you've been setting up the story so that it looks like the defendant is going to be convicted, and now you say the jury voted to acquit the defendant, the reader might miss that you say acquit instead of convict. I mean, after all, acquit and convict kind of look similar. And so it's possible, especially a reader who's not paying careful attention, might not notice that you switched. But when they see however, they're going to be on notice at that point. Wait a second. I was thinking he was going to get convicted, but now I see the word however, so now I know there's a surprise. I'm not sure what the surprise is going to be. I'm not sure why we're having the surprise, but I'm prepared for the surprise. And that helps me interpret the West. So when I see however, I am prepared to see acquit. So while I call the however interruptive, and it's distracting the reader from the meat of the sentence, it's also acting to prepare the reader for what's going to come next. So you only want to use an interruptive if it's helping the reader get to the finish line, so to speak. Okay. Another thing to tell you about however, and this is just unique to however, so you don't have to apply this piece of information anywhere else, is that it is a best practice not to start a sentence with the word however. I'm not going to go through the reasons why you should never start a sentence with however. Some people disagree. Some people say it's okay to start a sentence with however. Some people say it's okay sometimes, but not okay other times. Other people say you never should do it. My advice to you is just don't do it. Because again, there will be people out there, and they don't wear a sign on their forehead, so you don't know who is who, that will think less of you as a writer if you start a sentence with however. But you know what? It's nothing bad. There's no reason why you ever have to start a sentence with however, because you just stick it in after your subject if you really feel like you want to use the word however. Okay, so don't do this. Don't start a sentence with however. You may want to initially, when you're writing, actually have this on your writer's checklist so that you will, as you're going through doing your edit, do I start any sentence with the word however? And the way to do that quickly is to go to your find, type in the word however, and go through and see, here we go. Okay, that one's okay because it's not the beginning of the sentence. Oh, wait a second, that one's at the beginning of the sentence. I need to revise that. So that can be a smart thing to do. After you've done it for a few weeks, you're probably going to find that you don't want to start sentences with however. You've gotten out of that habit of doing that. Let's look at our next one. Another good interrupter is for example, and it works very much like however does. I'm going to remove it for a second so we can check to make sure that we have an independent clause here. Let's read it. Research skills are critical for legal professionals. So we have our subject, research skills. I'm going to underline that. We have our verb are, and let's read the whole thing. Research skills are critical for legal professionals. That's a clear expression of an idea. The idea is complete. And then we have the interrupter. The interrupter gives us more information. Hey, this is just an example of a phenomenon that I was talking about in the previous sentence. Maybe I said something like legal professionals need to have many skills. The research skills, for example, are critical for legal professionals. And so this is telling you, hey, I made a broad statement before, and now I'm giving you some specifics. So this is a clue. This is letting you know where I'm going in this story. This is helping you connect the dots from something previous. And that's why many times these interrupters are also called transition. They're showing the connections between an earlier sentence or an earlier paragraph and the sentence you're in the process of reading. As a result, interruptives and transition phrases and words typically occur near the beginning of the sentence. Okay, let's look at this next one. This is not a really good sentence. Our interruptive is very long. But let's read it to make sure it satisfies all of our conditions. So we've removed the interruptive, and now we're going to say the defendant insisted on testifying. So we have our subject, the defendant. We have insisted as our verb, and it sounds like a complete idea. The defendant insisted on testifying. Okay, so now let's make our interruptive come back in. And we see it's over the strenuous objection of his counsel. And you can see that this is providing additional information. It is interrupting the flow of the sentence, but it's a fact that you're probably going to want to include, especially if you're his counsel and it didn't go well, right? That's important information. I would argue, though, that this sentence would probably stylistically, not grammatically, but stylistically be better if we said over the strenuous objection of his counsel, the defendant insisted on testifying. Because now we're not interrupting ourselves. We have our introductory material, so we're talking about Rule 5, and then we have our complete sentence. So this is probably better. This is not grammatically incorrect, but this type of interruption is going to cause the reader to kind of lose the train of thought. He might actually have to go back and say, now, how did I start? Oh, yeah, that's how I started the sentence. Now I'm going to finish it. You don't want the reader to have to do that. So this would be better stylistically, but either one is grammatically correct. And let's look at our last sentence. Therefore is a very common interrupter or transitional. It's at the beginning of the sentence, so we could put this under the Rule 5. They are calling it a transitional expression too, but it could also, and I guess the reason why they're probably, well, introductory material, I mean, I think it could fall under Rule 5 or Rule 6. Let's position it, though, so it's not at the beginning. We could say the motion, therefore, was granted. And again, we have all the things we need. We have our subject, and we have our verb, which, by the way, is in passive tense. Was is a to-be verb. Granted is a past participle. Motion isn't granting. Some judge somewhere is granting the motion, so motion is being acted upon. And again, we could add by a blue monkey. The motion was granted by a blue monkey. There's a few judges who maybe look like a blue monkey. There's, perhaps in their stern face and their style, but they really aren't blue monkeys. They are human beings, obviously. So, but this is a a complete sentence. It can express a complete idea. And so we can interrupt ourselves by putting the therefore. Unlike, however, we can lead sentences with therefore. We can also lead sentences with for example. Most interruptives can go, I would say virtually all interruptives can go at the beginning of the sentence. Just however is the one that you can't. So you can put therefore in either place. You could also use thus, or in conclusion. Lots of different words can function in this capacity. That's kind of a stylistic choice, whether you want to put it at the beginning or elsewhere. You probably also want to vary it. If you always put your transitionals in the first position of the sentence, that's going to get very repetitive. It's probably good to sometimes put at the beginning, sometimes put it in the middle, maybe even occasionally put it at the end. So that is, how do I get that to go away? Here we go. Okay, I do not know how to make that happen. Okay. Let me flip on over to another screen, see if, nope, okay. There we go. So I think we're done with Rule 6. Now, we've already talked about Rule 7 in the first lecture. And we have not talked about Rule 8. Okay, this is similar to an interruptive. And in fact, I think there might be times where you might not be sure which rule applies. Rule 8 says, use a comma to separate a phrase that shows contrast or contradiction. It was the plaintiff, not the defendant, who failed to attend the hearing. Let me just write that here. So, couple things to notice about this. We still need to have that independent clause. So let's make our, let's see, what are they calling it? They're calling it, we'll say, a contrasting phrase. Let's see if we have a complete sentence. It was the plaintiff who failed to attend the meeting. So you could, plaintiff is the subject and was is the verb. This is a little bit backwards in terms of a sentence. And you can see it was the plaintiff who failed to attend the meeting. By the way, when we're talking about human beings, we always use who, whose, or whom. We never say that. This, unless the plaintiff is a company, this would be incorrect. It was a plaintiff that had failed to attend the meeting. Human beings aren't objects, so we don't say that. Okay, so you can see we don't need the not the defendant. It was the plaintiff who failed to attend the meeting. In this context, we don't need the not the defendant, but you can see how that can be powerful if you are the person writing it. Maybe you represent the defendant, and so you want to show, hey, we did everything we were supposed to do. It was the other side that was delinquent or not good. So it was the plaintiff, not us, because we're awesome and perfect, who failed to attend the hearing. And so that's a way of contrasting our performance with the other. How about this one? I like to eat Chinese, not Italian food. Again, I am contrasting. We don't need this. This isn't essential to the meaning. I like to eat Chinese food. I have a subject. I have a verb. I have a complete thought. I like to eat Chinese food. But I want to contrast my love of Chinese food with my dislike of Italian food. And so that's what I'm getting at when I do this. And many times when we do this because this is a surprising fact. Maybe my last name is Da Vinci. And so one would think that I would like Italian food. Or perhaps there's some fact earlier on in which I was talking about how I love pasta. And, well, gosh, if you love pasta, how could you not love Italian food? So this is a surprise. Another reason is that I might want to emphasize this fact. I might want to draw special attention to this fact. And by contrasting it, we're kind of making it a bigger deal, kind of more interesting, in fact. So that's kind of how that works out. So usually when we see contrast or contradiction, we're going to see a word like not. Sometimes included in it would be but not. Sometimes and not. There's different ways of phrasing it, but this would be a common way of phrasing it. Okay, we have done Rule 9 in our last video, so I'm going to go on, and I'm going to skip Rule 10. And we're going to go on to Rule 11. Rule 11 is the rule about appositives. An appositive is a restatement of the noun or pronoun that came directly in front of it. Okay, so let me just give you an example. Bob is the mayor of Smithville. Bob drives a Ford. Okay? So we want to combine these two sentences. There's lots of ways of combining them. I'm just going to give you some examples here. So I'm going to take our first sentence, copy. We could do this. Okay, this is actually Rule 10, which we're not covering yet. So what we did is we just took our independent clause and we put together another independent clause and made it into one sentence. Another way we could do it is we could subordinate one of these clauses. We could say, while Bob is the mayor of Smithville, he drives a Ford. So this was an independent clause. It has all the elements. We have a noun, a subject, Bob. We have a verb, is. We have a complete idea. Putting while in front of it, though, subordinated that conjunction. We still have an independent clause here. And we have both facts in here. So these two sentences mean the same. In fact, I'd say this one provides a little bit more information because it's putting some contrast here between these two statements. But a third way we could do it is we could say, you know what, this is going to function as a definition of Bob. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with this sentence as the real sentencey thing that we're dealing with, the independent clause, and we're going to insert here this fact. The mayor of Smithville. And then we'll put it in commas. Okay, and you can see that this, our subject, and this, our appositive, mean the same thing. So we could have said the mayor, of Smithville drives a Ford. And that's Bob, right? Or we could say Bob drives a Ford. They're identical statements because Bob is the mayor of Smithville, and the mayor of Smithville is Bob. So when you define this term or redescribe it with another noun, in this case the noun mayor, we call that an appositive, and this is a very, very common thing to do in English. Let's look at the example we have and play around with this one. William Emery, the noted attorney, consulted on the case. So if we were going to break this up into two separate sentences, we would say William Emery is, probably we would say a noted attorney, but we could say the noted attorney. William Emery consulted on the case. So this would also work. But you can see how if you had, what you would essentially have if you never used an appositive is you would tend to have kind of short, somewhat choppy sentences. And you wouldn't be as much showing the connection between these things. So one way to look at it to see if you have an appositive is to take the green part and to take the yellow part, take out the comma, and replace it with is, are. If either one of those words work and it's a true statement, then you have an appositive, and you're right to use commas. And what you do is you put commas around the appositive. So you put a comma right after the word coming immediately before it, and then you put a comma right after the last word in the appositive, unless you would be using some other punctuation. I mean, it might be that that's the end of the sentence. So for example, Bob slapped Larry, comma, his brother. Okay, well, apparently it's true that Larry is Bob's brother. And so when we say Larry, we mean Bob's brother. They're the same person. So we could say Larry is the brother. So his brother is an appositive in this sentence. But obviously we're not going to put a comma here because that's the end of the sentence. So many times at the end you will have a period, but if there isn't terminal punctuation, you're going to put a comma there. Sometimes the statement will go the other way. Let me show you how that works. Let me show you what I mean. Bob slapped his brother Larry. So now his brother is coming first and Larry is coming second. And you definitely could say that Larry is an appositive for the brother. Let me explain. Let's talk for a second about whether we put a comma here or not. In certain situations, it's correct to put a comma. In certain situations, it's not. Let's imagine, give a little bit more data. Bob has 4 brothers. Larry, Curly, Mo, and Dave. Okay. When we put a comma, or under this situation, we shouldn't have a comma because it's essential that we know it's the brother whose name is Larry. Otherwise, maybe if we had left off the Larry part and we just said Bob slapped his brother, but we know Bob has 4 brothers, we don't know whether he slapped Larry or maybe he slapped Curly. He could have slapped Mo. He even could have slapped Dave. So, we have some information about the situation, but we don't have that much. Adding the Larry gives us a lot more clarity. And so in this situation, this isn't just nice to know information, it's essential for us to figure out what's going on. It gives us more data to make sense of this sentence. But let's go into another universe. Bob has only 1 brother. And that brother is named Larry. Okay, so now we're going to say Bob slapped his brother, comma, Larry, because this is not giving us any more information about the situation. We know what brother it is because he only has 1. We're just kind of giving an FYI. Oh, by the way, in case you forgot, that guy, you know, the brother, his name's Larry. But this doesn't help us identify which one of the brothers because there's only one. So in this scenario, the comma tells us we don't have to know this. When we don't have the comma, it must be essential for the meaning of the sentence. So in this case, it's not in a positive because it's not the same definition as brother because there's actually 4 of the brothers. But here, there's only one brother and he's Larry. Larry is the brother and the brother is Larry. Those are synonymous with each other under that circumstance. Okay, so let's go on, and we've already done Rule 12, and let's look at Rule 13. Rule 13 tracks very nicely with Rule 11, so let's look at that. Use commas to set off non-restrictive phrases, namely those including non-essential information. And that's just what we were talking about with Larry. It's non-essential when there's only one brother, because this doesn't help us narrow down the brothers. It is essential when there's only one brother. So this is an example of Rule 13. But this isn't the main category. The main concern that we have about Rule 13, the main relevance to have, is the that which issue. This is kind of an important thing, and it's one that many people get wrong pretty routinely. And in fact, I would encourage you when you are preparing documents, especially if this is one of those little twists or turns to legal writing that throws you a little bit, is to do a word search for this and to go ahead and do it for both that and which, and go through the document and find all of those and see if you're using it as a restrictive or non-restrictive clause. And that way you can save yourself some grief, save yourself some problems with it. Let's talk about, though, what the problem is. Okay. Imagine that I have, okay, well, we'll go back to Bob. Bob has 2 cats. Annie and Baby. Okay. And their names are Annie and Baby. Okay, so Bob took his cat, Baby, to the vet. Did I punctuate this correctly? Well, no, I didn't, because this is essential information. If all we hear is he took his cat to the vet, we don't know whether he took Annie or he took Baby to the vet. And so we need this information in here. This gives us additional information to make sense of the sentence. So it restricts the information. Before we saw this word, it could have been Annie or it could have been Baby. Our universe was twice as big, but now we've halved it. We know it's just the baby, the cat that goes by the name Baby. So we need that to restrict the data points, to restrict the possibilities. Bob has 1 dog, and his name is Fido. Bob took his dog to the vet. Okay, we're going to say his dog Fido. Okay, this is not necessary for the sentence because he only has 1 dog. Now I will tell you that it's fine not to put it in commas, but it's permitted to put it in commas under that situation. This situation here is analogous to the that situation, restrictive situation. And this is analogous to which, the non-restrictive situation. Let's look at the sentences that they are going to give us here. They have really long sentences. Okay, let's make my sentences up. Those look too long. Okay. Here we go. Bob's cat, Bob's cat that is named Baby went to the vet. So our question is, should we use, let me just put this in yellow, actually I'm going to put a line here. Should we use which or that under these circumstances? Do we need the material in the yellow to make sense or to help us make sense of the statement, Bob's cat went to the vet? Well, yeah, we do, because Bob's cat could be Annie or it could be Baby. So this gives us necessary information. When you need the information, you use that. And you never use that if it's a human being, but for animals and for inanimate objects, we use that. If you use that, we don't put it in commas, because again, one of the purposes of commas is to indicate that this material is not essential. It's almost like a parenthetical. You could drop it into a footnote or leave it out completely in the sentence. Now let's do this with our Fido. Bob's dog went to the vet. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we know Bob only has one dog. We're trying to decide whether this is a necessary part of the sentence, whether it restricts our data set, or whether it doesn't. Well, since there's only one dog, we're not narrowing down the field of dogs that could have gone to the vet. We're just getting more information about the dog that did go to the vet. So this doesn't restrict the data set. It's non-restrictive, so we need to use the word which. Again, we don't use which for human beings. We use it only for inanimate objects and animals. Whenever we use which, we need to put it in commas. So we're going to put a comma at the end of the word right in front of which, and then we put a comma at the end of the expression. Now, of course, if it's at the end of the sentence, we would put a period. So let me do this way. Bob walked his dog. In this situation, since we're ending the sentence with the word Fido, we would have a period there. So I've said how we use this if we're not talking about human beings, but what if we are talking about human beings? Well, in that situation, we would be saying who. So how about this? Let's change this to brothers and sisters. So we'll go back to our initial example here. Bob has 4 brothers. So Bob loves his brother who lives in Tennessee. Well, let's assume that all 4 of the brothers live in Tennessee. Actually, sorry about that. Let's assume actually Larry lives in Tennessee. Mo lives in Kentucky. I'm sorry, Curly lives in Kentucky. Mo lives in Texas. And Dave lives in Alaska. So Bob loves his brother who lives in Tennessee. Well, the question is, we're going to use who, whether it's restrictive or not restrictive. So what we're trying to decide now is whether we're going to put this with a comma or not. Well, this fact does give us information. We know that what we're saying is that Bob loves Larry, right? We're excluding Curly because he lives in Kentucky. We're excluding Mo because he lives in Texas. We're excluding Dave because he lives in Atlanta. Now, Bob may love all of his brothers, but we're just talking about his love of one particular brother named Larry. And so this does give us essential information to make sense of the sentence. Because it's essential, because it restricts our data set, it functions like that, and we don't put it in commas. Okay? In Tennessee. Okay, so let's now say Bob loves his brother who lives in Tennessee. Okay, the lives in Tennessee, again, it looks exactly the same in terms of the words that we're saying, but it does mean something different here. He only has one brother. He only has one brother who lives in Tennessee. That's the whole universe of his brothers. So this does not restrict the data set. Therefore, it's non-restrictive, so it's like the which clause. Well, what do we do with the which clause? We put it in commas. So we're going to put a comma right here. And again, if this weren't at the end of the sentence, we'd put a comma after Tennessee. It's a nice to know fact, but it doesn't fundamentally, I'm sorry, put a comma, period there, I meant a comma. Doesn't fundamentally change our data point. Okay, so here is a little bit more information about, or more examples about this. Let's just go through these for a second. Sometimes in a sentence, sometimes the way that you know whether that sentence is restrictive or not is by the use of that or which, or by use of commas. Because it might be that when I read this sentence, I don't know how many brothers Bob has. But when I see there isn't a comma here, I know he's got more than one brother. Because this is restricting the universe of brothers. So he needs to have at least one brother who doesn't live in Tennessee because of that lack of comma. Similarly here, I know that Bob has just one brother, and I also now know that he lives in Tennessee. This comma tells me I didn't need to know this fact in order to figure out who the brother is. So this comma helps avoid ambiguity. But if you misuse it, you actually might communicate data that you don't mean to communicate, that is incorrect data. So you have to watch this pretty carefully. Let me show you some examples about how the meaning can vary. The company that was bankrupt merged with ABC Incorporated. Okay, so there might be several different companies that we've been talking about above this sentence. And now we're going to focus on one of those several companies, and we're going to tell you which one. You know what? We've been talking about 4 companies, but now we're just going to focus on one of those companies. And I'm going to focus just on the one that's bankrupt. And let me tell you what that one did next. That one merged with ABC. So in that situation, we're restricting our data. We're not talking about all 4. We're talking about just that one, and we're telling you which one it is. So because it's restrictive, we're not putting it in commas, and we're using that. Let's look at the next example, which is very similar. The corporation, which was bankrupt, merged with ABC Incorporated. This is a different scenario. In the sentences above, we've been talking about only one corporation. And it's obvious which one we're talking about. We don't even, once we see corporation, we know what the writer's going, which one the writer's talking about. Now we're providing a little fun fact about it. But this fact isn't provided to let us know which one of the many corporations we're talking about. We know which one it is, but we're learning just one additional fact about that corporation. And so that's the function here. This isn't restricting the universe, so we use which and we use the commas. The corporation, you know, ABC Corporation, or DEF Corporation, which was bankrupt, merged with ABC. So the use of that and which and the use of the commas provides important facts. And if it's misused, you're not providing the right information. Now the word that and which are used for purposes other than establishing these restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. So there are times where you will use the word which without using commas. Let me give you an example of that. which pair of shoes will you buy? So when you're using it to form a question, as a question word, you're not going to put it in commas. And then again, that can have other meanings. So you have to consider the whole what the function of these words are in the sentence. This is a fairly subtle point, but it is an important point. And until you have this kind of locked down, my suggestion would be to have a cheat sheet of this handy so you can kind of remind yourself how this works every time you use these words. Once upon a time, maybe 100 or 200 years ago, native English speakers got this right most of the time. I'm guessing, I don't know this because I wasn't alive back then. That in which confusion probably wasn't a thing once upon a time, but we have gotten to the point where in everyday conversation, we confuse these two terms and we've kind of gotten muddy a little bit in our thinking in this area. And so you can't trust your ear, at least I can't trust my ear to always get this right. And so I either need to look it up or at least pause and think about it carefully. I'm going to close this lecture down, and we will, in our next lecture, go over Rule 10, and then we will also go over some additional information. Thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful day.